Reading the last message in a conversation that slowly faded can feel strangely quiet. The screen looks the same as it always did. The words are still there, arranged neatly in the same place they were the day they arrived. Nothing about the message has changed, and yet the feeling of looking at it now feels completely different. Sometimes it happens late at night, when the phone screen is the brightest thing in the room. The house is quiet, the day has already finished, and for a moment, there is nothing else to do except scroll through small pieces of the past that still exist inside the device. The conversation might have once moved easily, messages appearing throughout the day, small observations, ordinary jokes, a photo sent without much thought, questions about how the day was going, replies arriving quickly enough that the rhythm of the exchange felt natural, almost automatic. At the time, nothing about it seemed important. It was simply part of the background of daily life, like checking the weather before leaving the house, or glancing at the clock while waiting for the train. The conversation existed quietly, without demanding attention, without asking to be remembered. But when a conversation slowly fades, the change rarely arrives in a dramatic way. There is no single message that clearly marks the ending. Instead, the pauses between replies begin to grow longer. What once took minutes starts taking hours. What once took hours becomes days. The messages themselves grow shorter. A few words instead of a full sentence. A reaction instead of a response. Nothing about the conversation officially ends. It simply becomes quieter. And one day, without deciding to, you realize that the last message has already been sent. It might have been something small, something ordinary. A short sentence that did not feel like a final moment when it was written. Perhaps it was a simple talk later, or a casual comment about something that happened that day. At the time, it looked exactly like every other message before it, but now it sits at the bottom of the screen, quietly marking the place where the conversation stopped moving. Scrolling back through the messages, the earlier parts of the exchange feel different now. There are moments where both people seem present in the same rhythm. Small threads of attention weaving through ordinary days. Not intense, not dramatic. Just the simple presence of someone else appearing on the screen from time to time. The strange thing about these conversations is that they rarely feel significant while they are happening. They are made of small, ordinary pieces. A question about lunch, a complaint about work, a short message sent during a commute, a photo taken while walking somewhere. Nothing inside the conversation tries to become meaningful. And yet, when the conversation slowly fades, the silence it leaves behind feels larger than expected. The last message remains there quietly, not as an ending that was announced, but as a moment that only became visible after everything had already changed. Conversations that slowly fade rarely begin with distance. Most of them begin in the same way many small connections begin. In adult life, quietly, without expectation, without any sense that the exchange will someday be remembered. The first messages often appear casually. Perhaps they arrive during a workday when someone shares a small observation about something that happened earlier. Maybe it begins with a comment about a place both people once visited, or a reaction to something seen online. The first few messages rarely carry weight. They exist lightly, almost forgettably, but over time, the conversation becomes familiar. Messages appear in predictable moments. During lunch breaks, on the way home from work, late at night, when the day finally slows down enough for people to notice their thoughts. The conversation begins to weave itself into ordinary routines. The phone buzzes quietly, a name appears on the screen, and for a few seconds, attention moves toward that small exchange. Not because it is urgent, not because it is important, simply because it has become a natural part of the day. Many adult relationships exist exactly in this space, not intense enough to define life, but steady enough to be noticed. These conversations are rarely about large subjects. Most of the time they move through ordinary pieces of life: a complaint about traffic, a photo of a meal, a short story about something that happened at work, a quiet observation about how tired someone feels that evening. Nothing about these messages tries to be impressive, and that is often why they feel comfortable. There is no pressure to say something profound, no expectation that each message must carry emotional weight. The conversation simply moves along with the rhythm of daily life, reflecting the small moments that fill most ordinary days. But adult life has a quiet way of changing the space where conversations live. Work becomes heavier during certain seasons. Responsibilities shift. Family matters appear without warning. Days that once had small empty spaces begin to fill with obligations that were not there before. And slowly, without anyone deciding it directly, the rhythm of the conversation begins to change. Messages that once arrived during lunch breaks start arriving later in the evening. Replies that once came quickly now appear after longer pauses, not because anyone is deliberately pulling away, but because life quietly rearranges the hours of the day. Sometimes both people notice the change. Sometimes neither person does. The conversation still exists. The messages still appear from time to time, but the easy rhythm that once carried the exchange begins to loosen slightly, like a thread that is no longer pulled tight. There is no argument, no dramatic moment, just small shifts. And over weeks or months, the conversation slowly becomes something different than it once was. The quiet fading of a conversation can feel confusing because nothing clearly breaks. There is no single moment that can be pointed to as the reason everything changed. Instead, the distance appears gradually, spreading through the spaces between messages. At first, the pauses feel temporary. A delayed reply might simply mean someone was busy that day. A message that goes unanswered for a few hours might be explained by work, by errands, by the ordinary demands that move through adult life. And often, those explanations are true. Life is full of small interruptions. People carry responsibilities that do not always leave room for long conversations. But over time, something subtle begins to change in the feeling of the exchange. The messages still arrive occasionally, but the energy that once moved through the conversation feels softer now, as if the thread connecting the two people has loosened slightly. Replies become shorter. Topics that once opened into long exchanges now close more quickly. Sometimes a message sits unanswered for a day or two before another topic appears. Nothing about the conversation signals an ending, but something inside it begins to feel unfinished. There is a quiet moment that many people experience during this phase. It happens when someone opens the conversation window, reads the last message, and hesitates before typing anything new. Not because there is nothing to say, but because the natural rhythm that once made conversation easy no longer feels as clear. The pause before sending a message becomes longer. Sometimes the message is never written. The conversation remains still for another day. What makes these moments difficult to understand is that the connection itself may not have disappeared. Care may still exist. Respect may still exist. Memories of earlier conversations still remain somewhere inside both people. But the space where those exchanges once lived has slowly changed. Schedules move in different directions. Emotional energy shifts toward other responsibilities. The quiet attention that once flowed naturally into the conversation begins to settle elsewhere, and without anyone choosing it directly, the conversation drifts toward stillness. Eventually, the last message appears, but at the time, it does not feel like the last message. It is simply another sentence added to a long thread of ordinary exchanges. And then the conversation remains quiet. Days pass, then weeks. The last message stays where it was, quietly marking a moment that only later begins to feel like an ending. Looking at the final message of a fading conversation can sometimes feel like looking at a photograph taken before something changed. At the moment it was created, nothing about it seemed significant. But later, when the surrounding context has shifted, the image begins to carry a different weight. The last message often contains nothing remarkable. It might be a simple reply, a small acknowledgement, a casual comment about something ordinary. Sometimes it even includes a phrase that suggests the conversation will continue later. But later never arrives. The message sits quietly at the bottom of the screen, unchanged. What makes these moments difficult to describe is that nothing inside the message itself explains why the conversation ended there. There is no visible conflict, no sentence that sounds like goodbye, no clear signal that either person decided to stop speaking. The conversation simply reached a point where no new words appeared afterward. Many adults experience this kind of quiet ending in different relationships throughout life. Sometimes it happens with someone who once felt very present in daily routines. A person whose messages used to appear regularly, carrying small pieces of their day across the distance between two lives. At first, the absence feels temporary. A day without messages seems ordinary. Then 2 days. Then a week. Eventually, the quiet becomes part of the background. But every so often, perhaps late at night or during a quiet moment, the conversation window opens again. The earlier messages are still there. Scrolling upward reveals the earlier rhythm of the exchange. Small jokes, shared frustrations, comments about things that happened that day. In those earlier parts of the conversation, both people seem present in the same small space of attention. But now, the conversation exists only as a record of moments that already passed. The strange part is that nothing inside the conversation clearly explains how it reached this stillness. Life rarely provides explanations for these quiet endings. People move through different seasons of responsibility. Energy that once flowed easily into certain relationships shifts toward other parts of life. New routines form, other connections quietly take shape, and the conversations that once existed naturally begin to rest in the background of memory. None of this necessarily means that the earlier connection was false. Most of the time, those exchanges were genuine in the moment they happened. The laughter was real, the attention was real. The small sense of presence that came from seeing someone's name appear on the phone screen was real. But adult life has a way of redistributing attention without ceremony. Time becomes divided among work, family, obligations, and personal limits that slowly reveal themselves as the years pass, and the conversations that once felt effortless sometimes find themselves standing at the edge of those shifting priorities. The last message remains there quietly, not as a dramatic ending, but as a small marker of a time when two lives briefly moved through the same space of attention. The conversation does not disappear. It simply stops moving. And eventually, the silence surrounding it becomes part of the quiet landscape of memory, where many ordinary connections rest once their moment in daily life has passed. Sometimes, long after a conversation has faded, the last message appears again almost by accident, perhaps while searching for an old photo, perhaps while scrolling through older messages during a quiet evening. The conversation window opens, and for a moment, the earlier exchange becomes visible again. Nothing inside the screen has changed. The same words remain in the same order. The same pauses between messages still exist in the timeline of the thread. But the person reading the conversation is no longer the same person who once sent those messages. Time has moved forward. Other days have filled the space that once belonged to that exchange. New routines have formed. Other responsibilities have taken shape. Different conversations now appear on the screen more often, and yet, for a brief moment, the earlier rhythm of that fading conversation becomes visible again. The last message sits quietly at the bottom, still ordinary, still simple, still written in a tone that did not expect to become the final sentence. There is something quietly human about these unfinished endings. Many relationships in adult life do not close with clear words. They do not end with a final conversation explaining what changed. Instead, they slowly settle into silence while both people continue moving forward in their own directions. The earlier connection does not vanish completely. It simply becomes one of many quiet memories that belong to earlier chapters of life. Occasionally, seeing that last message again may bring a small recognition. Not necessarily sadness, not necessarily regret, just the quiet awareness that at one time, for a short period, two people shared small pieces of their days with each other. And then, gradually, life moved them into different rhythms. The phone screen eventually dims again. The conversation window closes, and the last message returns to its quiet place in the long list of past exchanges, a small silent reminder of a connection that once existed in the ordinary spaces of daily life.